and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Our guests this time are Stan Tenen, who is an engineer and an inventor. He's designed and produced optical, electronic, and medical equipment, holds several patents, and he's currently researching a startling discovery that he made 10 years ago of what appears to be a pattern or code in the letters of the Hebrew text of Genesis. He calls the project the Meru Project. And John Keller is a businessman. He's a world traveler. He's a mountaineer. He's led expeditions to different parts of the world. He's always been fascinated by science and ancient religious texts, and he's been working with Stan on the Meru Project for the past year. Let's summarize briefly. We talked about it before, but let's summarize what your research is. What is the Meru Project?
The Meru Project is an attempt to technically analyze the text of Genesis and related material in the hope of finding what I intuitively saw 10 years ago. I'm a pattern recognizer, and I happened to look at Genesis in Hebrew, and I don't read Hebrew. When I looked at the page, my eyes caught a pattern to the letters, and I spent 10 years trying to find out what that pattern was, and recently made some breakthroughs into understanding how to decipher the pattern. For those who know about it, this is not Kabbalah, although some of the legends of the Hebrew mystical tradition are validated by this material.
Okay, John, maybe you can help put us in very simple English. Stan is ascribing mathematical formulas or values to the various letters in the text of Genesis, and by computation of those formulas and numbers comes up with some kind of visual patterns.
Yes, the visual patterns are startling for me because, as I mentioned earlier, when I went to Egypt 2 years ago, I saw the Great Pyramid for the first time, and I was fascinated by the possibility that, according to legend, that the pyramid was built by a lost civilization. And the text of Genesis is so old, no one really knows where it came from. It's supposedly the most documented text that we've got, and yet there are a lot of gaps in its history. So when I looked visually at the pattern that exists in the first sentence, it superimposes very, very well, suspiciously well, on top of the Great Pyramid. And that led me to intuitively follow Stan's line of thinking and to support his work for the past year.
Stan, you have worked primarily with Genesis and the Hebrew version of the first book of the Old Testament of the Bible. Have you had a chance to look at ancient sacred texts in other parts of the world?
I haven't looked in depth. I've read about some of the Sanskrit and some of the Babylonian, Sumerian, and Zoroastrian material, ancient Persian material, as well as Pythagorean mathematics, Greek science and math, and read up on medieval alchemy and all that. I knew nothing about that when this started. I was the kind of scientist that used to sidle past the occult shelf in the bookstore for fear anybody would see me near the stuff. So I had no religious or historical background and only a technical education. The legends about the Vedic texts, the Vedas, and some of the Sanskrit writings are the same as the legends about the Hebrew texts, namely that the secret of the universe is somehow encoded in the first letter, and if you can't understand it from the first letter, it's repeated in greater detail in the first word, in the first sentence, that there's a whole hierarchy, but constantly describing the same image, basically describing a holographic, hierarchical type of an image. I don't know if you're familiar with holograms, but in a hologram, if you blot out 90% of the holographic negative and look through just a little, maybe, corner, you can still see the whole image, but it's at reduced resolution. The legends about the Sanskrit texts and the Old Testament both claim that quality, that you can look at a small section and see the whole, sort of parallel to a seer seeing the universe in a grain of sand, except I took it more than metaphorically. I took the metaphorical legends seriously and saw where they led to. The legend that the Hebrew alphabet was changed from 22 to 27 letters so a future student could redeem the alphabet. Well, redeem in a technical sense might mean decipher, and that's interpretation of the old teachings is the ones that I took as clues as to how to look at this and how to determine what the coding was. I also used as a pattern, as a background, a message that we sent. The NASA people at Jet Propulsion Lab sent a radio message out of the radio telescope in Puerto Rico, in Arecibo, which is a mathematically coded message And the reason was they didn't expect extraterrestrials that the message was aimed at to understand an Earth language. Likewise, if Hebrew was a very ancient language whose roots were lost and only redefined by the Septuagint translation to the Old Testament at 285 BC, and by the addition of vowels by the Masoretic rabbis around 1000 AD, then we don't really know what those Hebrew words mean. As a matter of fact, since the text wasn't even divided into words, that were just strings of letters originally, we only know where the word divisions are because of the use of the 5 additional letters defining final letters, ending letters for words. And so the modern translations are basically allegorical descriptions of the technical material that we seem to be finding underneath the text.
So what you're suggesting then is that while we have a grammatical meaning ascribed to these texts, the ancient texts,
I'll give you an example.
particularly the Bible, that it's a mathematical or scientific,
Give you a simple
it's a
example.
scientist trying to tell me something
Right.
that I couldn't otherwise understand.
Right. Let's say you were an Essene rabbi, Essenes being one divergent group of Jews around the pre-Christian era, and you were trying to describe to a soldier who was insisting on a translation what your sacred books meant. You couldn't use a full technical description because you wouldn't have respected the intelligence of the soldier. Anyone that was going to use duress to force you to do something wasn't a very high consciousness person. And as a zealot, as a religious fanatic in a sense, you weren't going to be able to describe something. You wouldn't respect that person. But also because you were a zealot, you wouldn't lie. You would use the best, simplest explanations you could do to parallel your meaning. And so it would be like explaining relativity theory to a grade schooler. You'd use metaphors from daily life. The best example I can give is the golden rule and the golden mean. In mathematics, there's a function called the golden mean, which is basically the shape of the Parthenon. It's a function that's used to generate the most pleasing rectangle shape. You look at your favorite Scandinavian coffee table, it'll be that approximate shape. The golden mean generates all of the spiral shapes that we see in living creatures, seashells, the pattern of spirals on a sunflower, on a pine cone. The reason we have 5 fingers, 5 toes on each hand is because the golden mean is based on a function of the square root of 5. That is the exponential multiplier for all life processes. Well, the golden rule says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you lived in the ghetto, you might say, what goes around comes around. If you were an alchemist, you might say, as above, so below. The golden mean has that property because the golden mean squared, and this is the only number that has that property, if you go above, as above, the golden mean squared is the golden mean plus 1. And if you take the inverse of the golden mean, you go below, 1 over the golden mean is the golden mean minus 1. As above, so below, mathematically. You couldn't describe that to the Greek soldier. You would instead pick from the metaphors, from the beliefs that were already prevalent in the area, from the legends and mythology that were acceptable, a parallel description that could be understood. And as honestly and diligently as possible, you would use literary metaphor to cover the technical description, if you were being honest, and if you were in that position.
So
that's what I guess
then,
may have happened.
Okay, Genesis then is a description of the nature of the origin of the universe. God created the light, and He separated it from the darkness,
Genesis.
and He created the land from the waters and part of the waters and so on.
And the people who take the Old Testament literally, word by word in translation, emotionally believe that the beginning of Genesis describes the creation of the world. There's a lot of debate about that right now. What is so extremely startling about this data is that if you look at the pattern of the letters, and again, I'm not talking about the traditional Kabbalah, which alleges this but can't demonstrate it, at least doesn't seem to be publicly able to demonstrate it. If you look at the pattern of the letters, you get geometrical shapes, just like you get a TV picture from the Arecibo message. Instead, here you get 3-dimensional shapes. The Arecibo message is a TV picture, is a 2-dimensional picture. The shapes are what the mathematicians and scientists are now beginning to suspect is a realistic description of the physical shape of the first states of matter. There is a shape called the twister, Roger Penrose's idea, that is a twisted torus. And it's supposed to be the shape of of a mathematical entity that exists before the first quark, before the first subatomic particle, quark now being the most basic subatomic particle. The shape of a black hole is the same shape. The shape of a photon, if you could say it had a shape, would be a wave turned on itself, a toroidal shape. Well, the shape that you get generated by the first sentence of Genesis is topologically the same. It's a twisted torus. Now, that doesn't prove they're the same thing, but that's very suspicious. And when you go on in the text, you find that the coding continues. I have not been able, without the aid of computers, which we don't have at the moment, to do the analysis of that much data. And so I've limited myself to the first natural unit of the text, which is the first sentence, and only looked ahead to check out key points to see if things really still were going on. But I have not been able to crack it in detail. Not only that, but the level of which we've deciphered this to so far is not the information in the text itself, we don't think, but rather the error correction code. And what do I mean by that? If you were using computers to send data from city to city, from bank to bank, you'd want to be sure you didn't make a mistake. And so you include the data in an error correction code so that if you get a bad parity reading, or well, it doesn't matter what you call it, then you know that something happened, you'd send the data again. Well, the first sentence of Genesis is so highly specified by this pattern that if a letter were to have been lost over the centuries, it would have to be uniquely replaced by only one possible letter. That error corrects for one mistake in the text. That implies that there is information coded at the letter level, and that the word level is probably a metaphorical description of that more subtle, more abstract information.
Stan, remind me of what letter is it that occurs after 2000 that's very common?
Well, for instance, we've identified, there's a letter in the middle of the Hebrew alphabet, which unfortunately doesn't correspond to an English letter. It's the letter Samach. It's a fairly common letter, but not among the most common. It doesn't occur for 2,207 letters into the text. Now, that would have meant nothing except we had previously identified the letter Samach as somehow related to this golden mean function. It turns out the golden mean to the 16th power is 2,207. To within a fraction of a decimal place.
Okay, we're getting pretty far out there, and it's going to be difficult for
Right, let's go back to the
program.
basics. Right.
Let's get back to the basics and remind people that they're listening to Infinity on KCBS in San Francisco. John, I want to ask you a question. I'm going to try to simplify all of this complexity that has been discussed to this point to say that Stan is looking at an ancient text, specifically Genesis from the Bible and the first portion of Genesis. He is ascribing mathematical values to the various letters, and in so doing is creating a picture, symbols, geometric shapes and designs. He is suggesting that those shapes may correspond to what is happening at the highest level of physics right now, and trying to determine the nature of matter and the nature of reality and how the universe was created and what black holes are and many of the other questions that are currently being written and discussed at the highest level of physics. In your experience, you've been with the project for about a year, and you are not a scientist to the degree that Stan is. Do you believe that there is a connection in this from some other corner of the universe, that if the code in fact exists, if we accept what Stan is working on...
Must remember it's conjecture.
Yes,
this
is conjecture.
If it is true...
We're very suspicious.
If it is true that the codes do exist, someone had to put them there.
Right. Well, one of the legend that has attracted... I'm going through a personal transformation in my own life right now, and I'm very interested in what's going on among physicists our age, in their 30s and 40s. Fritjof Capra is one of them, that's trying to connect modern-day physics with ancient Eastern teachings and showing the parallels that exist in those areas. Let's assume, for example, that the legends are correct and that there was an ancient civilization called Atlantis. And we're the top scientists, and we know, we have a premonition through intuition, through meditation, through some kind of scientific analysis, that there's going to be some kind of catastrophic event that will wipe out our civilization. Why not try to send out in time and space some kind of message coded that will stand the test of time, that will be rediscovered some point in the future when society, civilization has rebuilt itself and approaches what I call a golden age, where the physicists are talking to the metaphysicians, where the archaeologists are talking to architects. And there's a coalition of knowledge, and as we know, we're entering an age where there is an information explosion, an explosion of information. And suddenly people are talking to each other all over the planet instantaneously through, electronic communications. Well, this creates very fertile ground for the reassimilation of knowledge that may have been known to ancient people. And so it's a possibility that the text of Genesis contains that kind of information which will be of value to us.
And that's what drives you on.
Yes.
Let's go to another subject, if we can, briefly for a minute, and that is you mentioned the binary code that was used in this radio signal that was sent out into space,
Right.
just in case anybody happened to be out there with a radio receiver,
Project
just
SETI.
in case they picked up that signal and translated the signal into a TV screen type picture with little black dots and little white dots that would create a little picture, and one of the little pictures was a picture of a little man, and there was another one of a little woman.
It's a double helix and a man in the solar system, a picture of the antenna that sent the message, which gives you an absolute calibration of size, of wavelength, and a listing of some of the chemicals of life is what we chose to send out.
Okay, those are the elements that we chose to send out into space, and this is something that's real. It's kind of borders on science fiction, but
We did it.
It was it
Project
has been
SETI. I think they may have just gotten some funds after having had it cut too, so maybe they'll do some more. I don't know.
Okay, the information explosion that you talk about is a function of computer technology and the electronics. The binary code, as I understand it, has its roots in ancient Eastern writings. It exists long before we discovered it as a magical
Binary
way to...
just means counting by twos, and that's one way to tally. I'm not an expert on ancient writings. Certainly, you can analyze some. You can analyze the I Ching on that basis. The I Ching are pairs of trigrams forming hexagrams, and so you can look at the I Ching in base 2 or 3. As a matter of fact, someone has done that. There's a book that's out now that relates the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching uniquely to the 64 codons of the genetic code. Now, I'm not an expert on that, but I think it's really fascinating. I don't know how valid that work is, but those are the kinds of connections that seem to be coming up now.
Okay, let's get back to your research again specifically. What does your research suggest to you, Stan, about the theory of evolution?
Well, my research has not really been concerned with that. If you're talking about the creationism that's a takeoff from the beginning of the Old Testament, my feeling is that people who believe that have every right to that belief. That when you believe in something and you invest it with your faith, that's in fact how the world appears to you, and in fact you live with the consequences of the way you've built that worldview. Now, there is no meaning to saying that's right or wrong. It's right for you if it makes sense to you and it works for you, as long as you don't cram it down someone else's throat and they don't cram something you don't want down your throat. So I don't have any direct opinion. I haven't been working with the translation of the meaning of the words. My feeling is that the evolution being discussed for me is evolution relating to the beginning of the universe, not to the beginning of life, either on the macrocosmic level, the Big Bang, first cause, which is by nature toroidal. The center of a black hole, by the way, is now known not to be a singularity, but a torus, and the geometry of a black hole is also a torus. The macrocosmic level, or at the microcosmic level, that the creation that may be being discussed technically in the Old Testament at the letter level concerns the first subatomic particles, or concerns the most universal particle of which we're aware, the photon, the unit of uncertainty, which may be even the unit of consciousness. Arthur Young has written a series of books, and one of his hypotheses is that the uncertainty principle allows for consciousness in every entity in reality. Every photon, every being has consciousness because of the uncertainty principle. That's just a conjecture also. But those are the kinds of things that modern physics is making potentially possible. Not accepted yet, but people are starting to seriously look at them. There's room for it now. 19th century deterministic physics did not have room for these effects. With the advent of relativity, with the advent of the uncertainty principle and Bell's theorem, and well, you can read about any number of other modern scientific effects that are now known, you get opportunity for this to happen. My understanding of Genesis at this point is that the text is coded with some sort of a natural harmonic unfoldment of reality from some first cause. That basically what's going on is they're unfolding the universe of diversity from the Tao to yin-yang. Yin-yang, in my metaphor, would be heaven and earth. That basically that was a way of indicating duality in the first statement, not explicitly defining the sky above and the earth below. But I'm not saying people who believe that are wrong. They are not wrong. If they invest that belief with their faith, it will be true for them, and it would be arrogant of me to say they're wrong.
Regardless of the translation and regardless of whether we're looking at Genesis in English or Hebrew or whatever, and I'm going to make an assumption here, you tell me if it's wrong because you've done more study than I have, but there is an element that is common to all translations, and that is God. And
interesting you should ask.
Okay, tell me about what the mathematical translation of the symbols for God are.
Good question. There are two words most frequently used for God in the Old Testament, and one is the Elohim type of God, and the other one is the Jehovah, Yahweh, Tetragrammaton, the one that
I haven't heard of. I heard of the other two, but Tetragrammaton.
The Greek name means the name of four letters, Tetragrammaton. All right, it's a Greek word meaning the Yud Hey Vav Hey, God, the God that the Hebrews call Adonai in prayer, or Hashem, which means the name if they're being profane. Okay. My feeling is that the Elohim God is, in a sense, a representation of the background radiation that pervades all of space-time. That it's feminine, it involves a swirling motion, and that the energy is essentially continuous and all-pervasive. The Yahweh God, and the Elohim God is the God of Genesis, of the beginning of Genesis. The Yahweh God is the God that interacts directly with people. Two gods together are described as the Great Sea in some of the mystical material. Again, we're embedded in electromagnetic radiation. The Yahweh God, if you analyze the meaning of the letters Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, in English that would be I, E, F, E. Those are English order in the alphabet. My feeling is that those letters describe a helical vortex, basically a line you could draw on a torus, and that they represent the parts of the universal electromagnetic field that interact with us. That's a masculine effect. The Yahweh God operates in pulses, has a polarity to it. The Elohim God has a circularity, a regularity.
Let me go back to ask
complements.
You, where is this coming from now? This is your
coming
impression
from
of
a
these
mixture
things,
of my
you're talking about an electromagnetic background and force, and then feminine nature and everything, and that's all.
One, this is 110% conjecture.
Okay.
It has a small chance of being true, a reasonable chance of being partly true, and no chance at all of being completely true. I'm in the middle of this research. This is not final conclusions.
Okay.
No, nothing is proven here. It comes from the Hebrew and Christian traditions relating to Yahweh and Elohim, and it comes from my analysis of what those letters individually might mean and what meaning they would have if you connected them together. The spelling of Yahweh is basically 4 characters in a row. If each of those is a mathematical operation of some type, then they have a corresponding geometrical shape, perhaps one that can be drawn in 3 dimensions. And so if the shape of that name has the same shape as a torus, then I think that the torus and those letters are connected somehow. That's a scientific principle. If a formula holds for 2 principles, then you think they may be related.
Okay, will you describe a torus for us again?
Torus is a donut, an inner tube, a bagel. Since I'm looking at the Hebrew, we'll call it a bagel. I'm from New York, if that isn't already obvious. And a torus is simply an inner tube shape. I don't know, for instance, yet if the torus I'm looking at, because the amount of data I've looked at isn't enough, and I can't see it clearly enough, if it has a hole in the middle or just a point. Sometimes you buy a bagel and it's all closed up in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not sure if my bagel has a hole through the middle all the way, a full circle, or if it's just as a singularity. I can't tell from the resolution that I get from the first sentence. I have to be able to analyze more of the text to do that. We're at the moment trying desperately to find some access to the computer that we need to do that.
You mentioned something earlier to the effect that you aren't a particularly religious person, and you took other than a religious perspective in your original approach to the subject matter.
Right.
How has your research to this point affected your spirituality and your
Very good
religious
question.
consciousness?
Well, I am not religious now in the sense of organized religion, but whereas in the past I could say my parents were Jewish, so nominally I'm Jewish, and if I were religious I'd consider myself a Hebrew, I consider myself now an aspiring Yahwist. It's my belief that originally this material was technical as well as literal. I'm not putting the literal down here. And that I identify with the technical principles involved. I tend to think of myself as fairly rational. However, I've been awestruck by the technical material. Now, if a sense of awe at something is a religious experience, then I'm religious to that extent. I've been shaken by what I've seen. I've been shocked as a objective researcher in finding what I think may be a valid topology of first cause where it belongs at the beginning of Genesis, and finding that that's in fact what the most ancient traditions claim, and not only for Genesis but for some of the Sanskrit material as well. That's startling to me. Not coming from a religious background, the last thing I would have considered was that Genesis was true. Now I've got a lot more respect for that.
John, who are some of the people who have seen this work so far, and what kind of reactions have you had from them?
Well, we presented the material over the past 12 months to a number of people. Some businessmen, some religious leaders. Ram Dass heard the material, and he had a favorable response. Everyone has responded enthusiastically once they get a chance to look at the actual documents and the research, because so much can be said through a picture that we would take quite a bit of time to describe here. One thing I would like to ask Stan is, of what ultimate importance is this work? I mean, of what significance is it to you?
Right. Now, we're not making any claims from this research that hasn't been made for thousands of years, and I'm sure you've heard similar statements by people you've interviewed already. There's nothing new in what we're saying. It's all in the old documents, in the old mystical teachings and the religious teachings. What's new and potentially different here is that on the basis of this technical approach, it's possible to perform technical tests that if I say I've had a transcendental experience from reading the Old Testament, that's my personal experience, it's not part of objective reality, and I can't share it with you. Because I've got a technical approach to this material, it's just possible, if we do our homework carefully enough, if we don't fudge to make it look good and all that we've got a nexus between physics and metaphysics here, that we can show the technical community that what they've dismissed as old mythology has technical meaning at the letter level. And that may even humble some of the scientists, because they may somehow start looking at older civilizations with a little more respect, particularly if there's new science there. And shown to the religious community, it validates the emotional appeal of the Old Testament. There are vastly more religious people out there than there are technical people. And for there now to be technical evidence that their beliefs have a valid scientific foundation, not the one they expected, but a parallel one, is to me very, very impressive. And I think it's an opportunity to get the religious priesthood and the scientific priesthood to connect to each other again.
You've been listening to Stan Tenen and John Keeler on Infinity. Remember, you can now hear Infinity twice each week, on Saturday nights at 11:30 and Sunday nights at 10:30. If you want to contact us for any reason at all, write to Infinity, KCBS San Francisco 94111. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thanks for listening.
Mm-hmm.